Morning, everyone. I'm Mara Manis, the Executive Director of NYSCA. So glad that you could join us this morning. We have almost 300 people joining us from all across the state, and we're so thrilled to have you with us. As I watched that, as I was looking photo of Caramore, I was reminded of just how excited it is that we are all finally at the reopening of the arts together, and look forward to seeing everyone at many different occasions around the state. I wanted to take a moment to thank our staff, who's worked so tirelessly to reimagine our grant opportunities this year. This is in direct response to everything that we've heard across the field for the last couple of years, and we're really thrilled to be able to bring more accessible and a more streamlined process to you all. We have made sure that regardless of the kind of work you do, whether you're an artist or an organization, that you have an ability to apply to NYSCA this year for funding. I want to also remind you that we will continue to have webinars this week. And so please check out our FY2022 webinar page for more information about those webinars. And you'll find our schedule as well as registration links for all upcoming webinars and virtual office hours on that page. Today's webinar will be an overview of our FY22 Round 3 support for organizations. And Kristen and Christine are here to walk you through the eligibility, timeline, and pre-qualification. Many thanks to those of you who submitted questions in advance. We will have a dedicated Q&A session following the presentation, and you can still submit your Q&A through the Q&A feature at the bottom. And we really do encourage you to listen to the entire presentation before submitting your questions, as many of those will be covered in the slides that are included today. A reminder that today's webinar will be posted on our website, along with the presentation deck for you and anyone else to review at any time. And I'm now pleased to turn this over to our program directors, Christine Herron and Christine Leahy, to walk us through Round 3 support for organizations.
Thanks so much, Mara. Good morning, everyone. So I'm Christine Leahy. I'm the director of the Arts Education and Facilities Projects program.
And I'm Kristen Herron. I'm Program Director for Architecture and Design and Museums here at NYSCA. If we can have the slides. So this is just a reminder for you, always go to our website, please read the guidelines. There's lots of great information and instructions there that will help you in the process. Next slide, please. But I really want to welcome so many of you here. Christine and I are really excited to have so many different organizations from across New York State in this webinar today. And we recognize that a number of folks on this call are new to our agency. So I wanted to take a moment to introduce you to the New York State Council on the Arts, or NYSCA. NYSCA is what you're going to hear us use to define ourselves, and it's the common name for our agency. NYSCA is dedicated to preserving and expanding the rich and diverse cultural resources that are and will become the heritage of New York State's citizens. That's our mission statement. It's where we start. And as you can see, it doesn't define any specific type of art form. It's really open to so many different expressions of creativity that can exist within the state. And that's what we're really excited to encourage more applicants from multiple areas this year. And our work at this government agency that was founded in 1960, so we've been around for quite a while, is really guided by 3 fundamental principles, which is that artists are the center of all creative endeavor. We want to support strong arts and cultural organizations because they are critical to everyone's life. And we want every citizen of New York State to be able to have a meaningful connection to creativity, and that we acknowledge every community has a right to cultural self-determination. Next slide. So eligibility is an important starting point, and pre-qualification is your #1 place. For those of you on this call who says pre-qualification, I have no idea what this is. I'm going to give you a quick overview, but it is where you need to go immediately after this webinar. So if we could see the next slide. All New York State nonprofits must achieve something called prequalification through the state's grants gateway. What I most recommend is, in the middle of this slide, is to go to the 2022 funding opportunities, the manual, scroll down till you get to section 8. It walks you through the steps to achieve prequalification. This is a process that essentially identifies that your organization is fiscally and managerially stable and solid. You will have to upload a number of different forms, from maybe your 990s to identifying whether your organization has certain plans in place. But the key information is in section 8. You need to jump on that right away if you are not pre-qualified. And the real folks who can help you with the detailed pre-qualification questions are found at help@arts.ny.gov. So don't hesitate to ask questions if you're confused. I know from some of the questions we got in advance that folks feel really stressed out about pre-qualification. It can feel like a hurdle, but I'm going to tell you, you can absolutely do this. You have all the materials. I am confident at your organization. It's just a matter of uploading them into a system, and sometimes having a little back and forth with our pre-qualification specialists just to make sure you've got all the right information. So it takes a little time. That's to be upfront, but it's very doable. It really is. And I encourage you all to start working on that right away. Next slide.
So our grant guidelines flow from the mission and the values of the agency that Kristen walked you through. Today's webinar, of course, is focusing on one category in round 3. And support for organizations is the spot where most organizations will be coming. So whether you are a returning grantee, you've been getting support for years, or you're new and you want support for your arts programming, this is the spot where you come and you'll make one application. So that's the big change this year, is that instead of making multiple requests, figuring out where you might fit, we're going to look at your organization holistically. We're still going to be supporting all the wonderful disciplines that we've always supported, everything under the sun, basically. But we want to give you the flexibility to use the funding where you need it most. So key dates are up here. Award ranges are here. And let's go to the next slide.
All right, I'm going to go back again to some more eligibility points that are critical for this process. You must
and
be
if we could go to the next slide for that. Sorry to interrupt. I just want to make sure we get the right.
Oh, wait, I have the slide up.
Maybe a little bit.
Eligibility slide.
Oh, we do. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Okay. So you must be a nonprofit organization, incorporated or registered to do business in New York State, or you might be a Native American tribe in New York State, or a unit of government in New York State municipalities. Your principal place of business must be located in New York State. That might seem obvious, but you'd be surprised. It's actually not. If your organization is unincorporated, you can still apply to support for organizations, but you must be fiscally sponsored by an eligible nonprofit, which applies on your behalf. If anyone has questions about that, we can certainly help, but you may apply as an unincorporated organization if you are sponsored. And the last point, and I want to note, we're going to come back to this last bullet multiple times in this presentation because I know it's a stickler for a number of folks. It's a little confusing for some. You're eligible if you do not currently have NYSCA funding for 2022. For organizations who have previously applied to NYSCA, this is typically a multi-year grant that might be a general operating support or a project support in our past categories. So you are eligible this year if you do not have funding already in place for 2022.
So what is going to be in this application? Though the portal opens on July 19th, all the questions, all the components are already listed on our website. It's been put into the chat. And there are 4 main sections that we'll walk through a little bit. But the overall change to keep in mind is that unlike in past years when we ask you what your plans are for the grant period, we understand that plans are more fluid these days, and the proposal is going to focus more on what you have done and what your track record is, which we do hope makes it a bit easier for you. So the 4 sections are, first, you'll have the opportunity to express if your organization is within or serves a historically underrepresented community. Then you'll establish your organization's mission and history and basically the reason it exists. And then the biggest section is when you can answer questions that reflect our criteria, which we'll go into later. You have the flexibility here to answer them in one essay, if that makes sense to you, or to break it up. And these questions will go into your past programming, your approach to access, your managerial decision-making process, and your role in the communities that you serve. Finally, the work samples section. In support materials, you will upload up to 3 work samples in one single PDF. So these can be links to past performances. It can be links to images from an exhibition. It can be excerpts from a published literary work. And it should reflect all the great arts activity that you have just discussed in your application. Next slide.
Someone asked us in the pre-questions if we could share examples of things that help applications stand out the most. And I think of this tip section as kind of the way that does that. And listening to Christine before, one of the tips I didn't include is to be very aware that punctuation and spaces count in your characters. So when you see 10,000 characters, remember that includes spaces and punctuation. And one way to help you in meeting your character count is to avoid passive voice. So that's my big thing, avoid passive voice. If you don't know what passive voice is, you can ask. But active language is usually a way to reduce character count. So overall, think about your narrative, your essay, if you will, your narrative as an opportunity to tell the story of your organization and its work related to arts and culture. And remember it this way, the applications that are the strongest will show us your strengths. So one of my pet peeves is when I see applications that say, we're the first of this, we're the best of that. That kind of statement doesn't really show me anything about who you are, what you do, or how you best serve others. So if you can provide details, we learn about your creative strengths by showing us through your language who you are and what you do, and not you telling us that you are one thing or the other. And when you think about the language you use to describe yourself, I also really want to discourage any jargon. There's often sort of grant makers jargon that can find its way in, or words that are maybe unique to your specific field that would not be readily understandable by others. Think carefully about how that comes across, because you want the language to be clear and flowing for everyone. Data is always very useful. You want to contextualize any data you provide so we can best understand how you serve its community. One of my colleagues once, and I'm going to get the animal wrong, but read an application that said there were more, I'm going to say deers than people in their county. Maybe it was bears, I don't remember the animal, but that was a very interesting contextual moment to understand the more rural nature of a county. So contextualizing your data is really important. And demonstrate how the work you do connects to and amplifies NYSCA's mission and values. Remember, you're applying to the New York State Council on the Arts. We started the show today with the mission statement, which is about arts and cultural organizations. So when you're applying to NYSCA, you want to be applying because you're a good fit for us to fund, because what we do and what we value matches who you are. So think about that as you write your applications as well. Next slide.
It's also helpful to think about the 4 criteria that your application is going to be scored on by panelists. These are listed here, and the application questions flow from these 4 areas: creativity, access, relevance, and managerial and fiscal competence. They're equally weighted. And the rubric on the next slide goes into more detail about what we mean by each of these. So this is also on our guidelines page, link again in the chat. And this can be a really useful tool for you as you're putting your application together. You may want to use it, for example, when you're writing your answer to creativity, you might want to have this in front of you as a reminder of what panelists are going to be looking for. Or you may simply want to write all your answers and then come back to this at the end as a way of kind of proofing or revising what you've put in. I'll give you, I want to make sure you all have time on your own to look at all of this and digest it. So I'm not going to go through every single thing, but would like to point out a couple of overall things to note. One is that in managerial and fiscal, we are understanding of the stresses of the current time, and the rubric does reflect that. So for example, the second bullet is demonstrates an understanding of challenges and organizational strengths and weaknesses. So that's not an expectation that all challenges have been overcome. The panel is going to understand that you've had challenges and is interested in how you're responding to them, what your process is. So candor is appropriate here. The other thing that I would note overall is that you don't see a separate section for diversity, equity, inclusion, or DEI. Those values are woven into each of these 4 areas. So they're all appropriate places to discuss your approach in this realm. And you'll see it come through in bullets such as payment policy to artists under managerial and fiscal, or alliances and partnerships under relevance. On to the next slide.
So the numerical bureaucratic side of this, I really want to kind of connect it back to the slide from Christine. So those of you who have applied to NYSCA before may notice that our rating system has changed. We're using a scale of 5 to 0. And you can see from the very, from the statements that you go from a high score where your application has shown that you exceed in all areas of the benchmarks in that past rubric, down to a 0 where maybe questions are left unanswered, or the activities are not focused on arts and culture. And when I want to go back to questions left unanswered, sometimes you have words in the, you haven't left blank space, but you haven't actually addressed what we've asked you to talk about. So that's sometimes what questions left unanswered can mean. But I want to encourage you to use this visual and the previous one as a tool, again, as Christine pointed out, as you're working on your application. Be really self-critical. So when you respond to this, to each of the sections of the 4 criteria we're looking at, be really self-critical and go back and say, all right, if NYSCA is assessing me on this example, like the one Christine gave, am I sharing information in my narrative that really connects back to that? Am I meeting some of those areas or not? Have I missed something? So you can use this scoring tool and the rubric as a way to help you shape that narrative. It's another kind of one of those tips. And I would also really encourage any of you to hand your draft application to a colleague or a friend or a family member who has nothing to do with this, and have them read that and have them give you some feedback too, because that can also help you realize where you have gaps in your application. So these scores are what our peer review panels will be using to rate each of your criteria. Those criteria will then be averaged to a single score. So as Christine mentioned, each criteria's weight is 25% of your overall score. So that's the practical side of the numbers. But again, I want to encourage you to think about this box as a way to help you in writing your application. So if we could have the next slide. So I mentioned, Mara mentioned as well, that a number of folks have asked questions already, which we really are grateful for. I'm sure there are many more. I see that there's a a number popping up in the Q&A option here and in Zoom. Christine and I have already pre-populated this PowerPoint with some of those questions. We're going to go through them, and then don't worry, we'll be able to tackle more later on. So if my organization has never applied to NYSCA before, can I apply?
The answer is absolutely. Maybe you've never heard of our agency. You're welcome to come in. There's no requirement of past funding or anything like that. Maybe you have received decentralization funding in the past. As long as you're not planning to apply for that again, you are welcome to come in as long as you're meeting the eligibility requirements that are laid out in the guidelines. So how about, Kristen, if I'm a really small organization, in fact, we don't have paid staff, we're entirely run by volunteers, can we come in?
Absolutely. Any organization that is a nonprofit that has arts activities can apply. So just be sure to review all the general eligibility, and size does not matter, anyone can come in. I am a multi-year applicant to NYSCA. Can I apply?
So this is a great question. We're definitely getting a lot of this. And a tricky question, it depends. So if your organization received general operating support or project support, and it's on multi-year that concludes this year, fiscal year 21, then yes, you should be reapplying as you have in the past, and you reapply in support for organizations. However, if your organization has a multi-year grant that goes into FY22, then no, you would not also be applying for support for organizations. You would wait until that grant has concluded and then reapply. If you're not sure which of these may apply to you, but you think you have multi-year, you can check, log into your account at arts.ny.gov, and of course you can reach out to any of us, the staff, if you need help figuring it out. Okay, what about if my organization usually applies for general operating support in music, and then we also apply for project support in arts education? Can I still make both of those requests?
So no, unfortunately you can't. Or maybe it's fortunately, because instead of having to write 2 applications, we're allowing you to submit a single application. So that request to support for organizations is one where you can highlight both of those activities. You can talk about, in Christine's example, your music and arts ed in the same application. And then if your application is successful, you may be able to use those funds in either activities. So this is really aimed at helping you, the applicant, reduce your workload so that you can discuss all of the activities you do in a single narrative. So I'm going to get a little trickier here. My organization has one grant. We're going to say it's general operating support, and it's on multi-year for 2022. But we usually get a second one, and that one is over in 2021. Can we apply for that grant that concluded?
The answer is no. So as we're saying, it's one application in support for organizations going forward. So that means if you have a grant, any grant for FY22, you're done, and that is your award. You do have the option, if you so choose, to decline that, so then you can come in and throw your hat in the ring for support for organizations. And it is up to you. The things that you have to weigh are that, of course, past funding is not a guarantee of future funding. So there's no guarantee that you would receive an award, and there's no guarantee that it would be more. It could in fact be less. So you have to weigh all those things in making your decision. But the really good news that we keep emphasizing is that if you do apply in support for organizations, you can use your award for whatever it was that you used to make your 2 requests for, and you don't have to figure out what fits where, do that kind of eligibility dance. So this is something else that you can feel free to reach out to staff about if you're having trouble making that decision. We can certainly talk you through pros and cons, but I would say that, you know, if you save yourself the trouble of writing the application, you know you have money in hand, and there's certainly a strong argument to be made for that. And how about, can my organization apply to both support for organizations and the recovery grant?
So if your organization is eligible for both, you absolutely can. You want to take a look at the guidelines for the recovery grants to make sure you meet the eligibility. And I would encourage you to join the recovery grant webinar, which is later this week. But yes, you can apply to both if you meet eligibility. So I read the guidelines, but I'm still confused. When will NYSCA's usual guidelines with GOS and programs be released? Can we apply for those too?
This is NYSCA's guidelines for GOS and programs. It's support for organizations. So for those of you that are familiar with what we had in the past, not to fear, everything that we have supported in the past is still getting supported. We still love all of the disciplines. We still want to support all of you. We still understand all of you and can answer all of your questions. So it is a change, but again, we hope that it makes your life a little bit more flexible. We hope that it makes it easier for you in coming in with an application in which you can talk about your entire organization and not just a piece of it. You don't have to project a project budget anymore where you have to break out, you know, one of your programs and figure out what the expenses and the income is going to be in a year. It is, again, much more holistic, and we can answer any questions you have about, you know, reframing yourself and making that adjustment to just one proposal. So again, there aren't going to be more guidelines that are released in the future. Everything that you have been used to, everything that you have been getting support for, and hopefully some other stuff that had a hard time fitting into our 15 different program areas before, will also be able to find a home in this new big tent. Next slide. So in terms of disciplines, the application does ask me in the beginning to select my organization's type and its discipline. So help me here, what's the right answer?
So there is no right answer. We have set this up to really ask you to self-define who you are as an organization. So you will be able to choose one arts discipline. And I know that a question that has popped up, particularly related to some of our other questions, is if you're an organization using Christine's example, that is both a music organization and does arts education activities. And if you are going to be applying to us with both of those, you might wish to choose other and list music and arts education. Other might also be a spot where you don't feel that your art form or your cultural expression appears in the disciplines, and you can choose from that too. So this is like a Rorschach test. It's like, what's the first thing you see? And that is what you describe. So this is who am I as an organization? That's what you choose as your arts discipline. Now, what if my organization is a literary publisher? It sounded like the support materials were all really focused on performing or visual organizations. What can I submit?
So whatever your discipline, we ask for 3 work samples that reflect who you are. If you're a publisher, you may want to submit links to past journals or PDF excerpts of a published work, or you could submit a link to a past event, such as a reading or a workshop. And remember, it's 3 work samples. It's all going to be put into one PDF, whether it's a link or some kind of excerpt. And remember that panelists are going to spend no more than about 10 minutes here. So if you do post something that's longer, let us know where to look or where to start. You may want to edit. Different applicants take different approaches, but just do keep in mind that panelists are reading and going through a lot of materials. So they're not going to spend more than about 10 minutes here, and just help direct them. Next slide.
So before we get to the new questions you guys have been adding to our Q&A, we want to make sure you're aware of how you can get help after this webinar ends. So if you have technical questions or you have pre-qualification questions, help@arts.ny.gov is your go-to. If you have questions about support for organizations or any discipline arts specific question, you want to contact the program staff that are most aligned to your work. So for those of you who have applied before, it's probably someone you're used to talking to because that's the discipline you've come in for. But if you're uncertain, you can see the link to the NYSCA contacts. And if you're still uncertain who you should speak to, any one of us is very happy to talk to you. You can start with an email is usually the best way because we may be on the phone and that can be frustrating. So it's always great to start an email and we can always set up calls to have conversations. If you have questions, we really encourage you to submit them 2 weeks before the application deadline. So for support for organizations, that would mean if you should really aim to send your questions in by sort of mid-August. We want to be able to have time to get those responses out and to share them with others because your question may be the same as others. And please remember that while I mentioned earlier, I encourage you to have your draft application be read by your peers or your friends. NYSCA staff cannot read your drafts and give feedback.
All right, should we start with some questions that are coming in?
Oh, Christine, do you want to talk about the next slide first?
Oh yeah, and please remember that we're in the middle of webinar week. We have a few more left. So tomorrow there's one on the recovery grants, and then the next day there's one on artist support. All of these webinars are being recorded and will be posted for anyone who's missed them, or if you want to relive the experience. There's a link up on this slide and that will be available later. It's most useful, of course, if you read the guidelines ahead of the webinar, so then you can come in prepared with your questions. So please avail yourself of all these resources. And I think now we're ready to go into some of the questions that have been coming in.
Christine, do you want me to take the first one and then we go from there?
Yeah, go for it.
Does that make sense? The first one I see is this one. And we have a lot, so we're going to do our best to get to as many as possible. These questions I am going to read verbatim just because you, the audience, don't know what they say otherwise. An organization can apply only once per round. Can we apply to round 3 organizational support if we already applied to round 1 live performance? So I want to break this down a couple ways. First of all, the statement that an organization can apply only once per round, that is not true. So as an example, round 3 includes the support for organizations that we are discussing today and the recovery grants, which will be discussed later this week. And organizations that are eligible may apply to both. So don't think of the rounds as I can only do one per thing. It all depends on your organization and what you're eligible for. So to the specific question from this individual, can we apply to support for organizations if we apply to the restart? The answer is yes. Just check the eligibility always.
The next question is related. Can an organization apply for both a round 3 support for organization grant and a recovery grant? Yes. Yes, they are not the same. Recovery grant is new this year. There's a webinar for it tomorrow. If you are eligible for the recovery grant and you're eligible for support for organizations, you may apply for both. And it's different from what we've been talking about earlier when we said, you can't apply for both music and arts education anymore. It's one application. Just to keep it confusing, you may apply to support for organizations and a recovery grant if you are eligible for both. And we certainly invite you to do so.
So the next question is actually 3 questions, and I'm going to read it, but I am going to say whatever organization posed this, you might want to follow up with direct questions to relevant program person just to make sure you get the exact information you need. So the questions are, do you provide ongoing cultural programs for federal tribes in New York State? Does the tribe need to have a 501c3? And do you support travel and payment for visiting powwow performers? I want to say that, yes, of course, we support Native American tribes in New York State, and cultural programs are absolutely who we are as an agency. We started at the top of the hour that prequalification would not be necessary in this case. So that will be something that you won't need to do, but you can certainly touch base with your relevant program staff person to get really specific into what you may or may not need to have as documentation. And in terms of travel support and payment for performers, these are a great question, and there's multiple parts to it as well. So first of all, paying artists is great. It is what we are all about. So paying performers, 100% is something we want to see organizations doing, and that's something you can apply to us for. In terms of travel, I want to reiterate or enforce that there is a further list of eligibility issues or points that you can see online. One of them is that New York State Council on the Arts funds cannot be used for out-of-state travel. So this is why this question may need more nuance. If this is within New York State, that's certainly viable. But if it's out-of-state travel, that is not something that NYSCA funds can be used for, although an organization certainly may use funds from other sources to bring in out-of-state performers for New York audiences.
Okay, the next question is about supplementary materials. The guidelines speak of a limit of 3 items, all of which together can be reviewed in less than 10 minutes. Does item mean that we must choose one event, or does item refer to one media file, such as a 3-minute video or set of slides about a type of presentation, such as exhibits or online speakers? So it's more the latter, 3 links if you're a performance organization. You don't have to necessarily limit it to one event. So for example, if you're an arts education organization and you're giving us one link and say it's your 2nd grade dance residency at PS 123, that file may be an edited compilation of like session 1, session 5, and session 10 in your residency. Or if you're a presenter, it could be an excerpt from 3 different performances. Do keep in mind that whatever you choose, it should reflect what you've talked about in your narrative. And it should give us like a fly on the wall view of like, you're there, you're a panelist, can understand what it's like to attend a program, experience whatever it is that you do. So therefore promotional videos or talking heads or, music overlaid, none of that really helps give us that fly on the wall view. You're really looking to illustrate what is in the application. So ultimately it's up to you to pick the things that can do that best in the limited amount of time that panelists are going to have.
How can organizations request general operating support in this process, and should we request a specific award amount? So you don't request general operating support. It's now called support for organizations. And this is the request that you will submit, where you get to talk about a number of activities you've done in the past and seek funding for what you do in the future. You don't request a specific amount. We did note that awards will be between $10,000 and $49,500. You will have a place on the application to identify for us where you would want to use those funds. That's really ultimately to help in the contracting process for those organizations that are successful. But again, general operating support as a term does not exist in our FY2022 guidelines. Support for organizations can function very like that, and that's what the category is called.
If a nonprofit has no full-time employees, is it eligible to apply? Yes, you're eligible to apply whether you are all volunteer, whether you have part-time employees only, or if you have full-time employees.
Does this replace our, sorry, Christine. Does this replace our annual application to a specific program like SAS, which is called Special Arts Services? Yes, it does. These are our guidelines for 2022, and you are very welcome to apply for support for organizations if you meet the eligibility.
What are the dates of the activity period covered by the grant? It's January through December 2022. So that's when you would be able to spend your award on activities that are taking place then. As we said previously, you don't have to discuss within your application what you're planning for those dates or project expenses. Your application is going to be focused on past activities as an indicator of what it is that you do and what you can do. And that is the contract that you'll sign with the state of New York if you're successful, will outline that contract period.
There's a question about the file limit in size, kilobytes, for materials that are submitted. And I have to confess, I do not have that off the top of my head. So I really want to encourage you to go to the guidelines, which will have more specific details loaded. And if that doesn't satisfy you, please contact us directly.
Okay, to be clear, is an organization that is not an arts nonprofit eligible? For example, if a community group that serves a culturally underserved population wants to apply to work with an artist in residence to conduct programming at its facility, would that be competitive or an appropriate request? So an entity like that could come in as a sponsored request. So our grants do have to go to registered nonprofits in New York State or units of local government or Indian tribes. So if you are not one of those, but you do arts programming, you can work with a fiscal sponsor. It's often easiest to do it with an organization that already applies to NYSCA, and there are several that have it within their mission to help organizations like this and act as fiscal sponsors to unincorporated arts groups. And then you will fill out your proposal, you'll answer all the questions, you'll work with your fiscal sponsor, who is the one who signs the contract, receives the money, and then works with you to grant it out and fill your final report. So again, that's known as a sponsored request. And yes, we absolutely welcome those.
It states funding amounts are between $10,000 to $49,500. Is that per year or per overall amount if we are applying for multi-year? That's per year. So if an organization is awarded a multi-year grant at $10,000, as an example, it's $10,000 in the first year, $10,000 for the second year, whatever the term of the grant is.
If we receive a grant, how much flexibility would we have to adjust the budget allocations we outlined in the proposal? So as Kristen mentioned earlier, there is no project budget. You don't have to outline what your projected expenses and income are. All you have to do is indicate what percentage of your NYSCA award would go to what type of expenses. So I might have said, I'm going to give 50% of my NYSCA award to outside artistic expenses. That's to pay the teaching artists that I work with. And the other 50% is going to go to marketing. And the question is around flexibility. If you are successful and you receive an award, there will be an opportunity at the time of contracting to revisit those percentages. If you so choose, you have to be proactive about it when you see your contract, reach out to staff, and then there's a little bit of back and forth. But it is possible. And then once your contract is signed, that is the expectation that whatever that 50% works out to be is actually spent in the category that you've indicated you would spend it on.
All right, multiple questions here. How do we determine how much we request, or how is the award amount determined, and how do we ask for multi-year? I'm going to go backwards on this one. You don't ask for multi-year. That is something that will be determined through the panel process and approved by our council. And you also this year don't determine how much you request. The award amounts will be determined based on the overall rating of your request. And essentially it depends on the amount of money we have available and the scores that we have. So we will go down from the highest score essentially until we no longer have funds to distribute. So you don't ask for the amount, you don't ask for the multi-year. The award amount is determined based on the rating and the available funds.
Does my organization need to pre-qualify if we are fiscally sponsored by an established 501c3 nonprofit? No, it's the applicant of record that needs to pre-qualify. In your case, that would be your sponsor.
Can an organization apply for round 3 organization for itself and also apply as a fiscal sponsor for another organization? Yes.
What time period should the support materials come from? Should it be 2020, 2021, etc.? I would say it's really up to you as long as it's reflecting what's in the narrative. So whatever it is that's going to paint a picture of what it is that you do. I understand you may be curious because so many organizations did things that were different from what they usually did last year. So if you want to illustrate, you do have 3 options for your work sample. So if you want to illustrate something creative and new that you did last year, with a web link to a virtual program and then something that you had done live previously, whatever you think is going to tell your story best.
Still confused. Is there a separate application for organization and recovery? Yes, there is. If you're eligible, you can apply for NYSCA Support for Organizations. It's the one we're talking about today. And you can submit a second different application for recovery funds. That webinar is coming up later this week.
Is there a blackout period for contacting program staff before the deadline? There's no such period, but we are recommending that you try to reach us by about 2 weeks before the deadline, and that's August 18th. And the reason is that we get really slammed at the end, and a lot of people are contacting us, so we can't guarantee that we would be able to get back to you in a timely manner. You can feel free to try, and we will do our best. But the recommendation is that if you can, you get going early so that you can make sure you get to us when we can guarantee that we can get back to you.
I'm new to applying to NYSCA and I don't have a specific program person to work with. Who should I contact if I have eligibility questions? So the answer to that, I would say, depends on what your eligibility questions are. If your questions are specifically regarding the pre-qualification process, I highly encourage you to contact help@arts.ny.gov. The folks responding there will be way more helpful than a program staff person because they know that system really, really well. If you want to discuss eligibility at a content level and you're just not sure which program is most relevant to your organization's work, I would just say you can either just randomly pick one of us, which is totally fine. We can all answer questions, or try to pick one that seems the most aligned to what you do, right? If you are a performance-based organization, you might not choose one of the visual arts people, you might choose the performing arts. But the bottom line is anyone at NYSCA will be happy to hear from you and will be happy to help get answers to your questions.
Can we submit letters of endorsement from supported artists as a work sample if we are not a producing/performing organization? I would say potentially, and again, it is up to you to submit something that reflects the type of programming that you do. If the type of programming that you do is not live performance or some other kind of engagement or literary work, if you are, say, a service organization or an organization that offers workspace to artists, I would say give something that gives us a better understanding of that programming. Evaluation materials could be really helpful. Sometimes, in general, for other, producing types of organizations, we don't really encourage letters of endorsement because they often don't tell us that much. But if you are a service organization and you're providing some sort of a service or a program to artists, something that reflects their experience, some form of evaluation, something that's going to give us that fly on the wall view of your programs is a good idea. So again, bottom line, it's up to you, but have it be reflective so that we get further understanding of what you've described in your proposal.
My organization just received its 501c3 status a year ago, and we haven't filed our 990 yet. So are we eligible? I think the best way to address this is your first step is always pre-qualification. And yes, the 990s are part of that process. So for this organization, I would really encourage you to contact help@arts.ny.gov to talk with a pre-qualification specialist to see what you need to do to get through that process first.
Does the award need to be matched? No, there is no longer a match. We're no longer asking for a project budget. So you don't need to identify a NYSCA request amount. You don't need to identify a match. We hope this is part of the revision that makes your life a little bit easier.
So I'm jumping over to another section of Q&A, and if you can all give me a moment, I'm going to kind of scroll through some of these questions. I am seeing questions that seem very specific to your organization. Questions like, if you're in more than one region, what do I do? What's the update on other applications I've applied for? So if you have really institutional specific questions, those are best answered by contacting one of us directly so that we can do that offline. I am going to, Christine, I don't know if you're scrolling to see, I'm trying to find ones that maybe we haven't yet addressed.
Here's one to throw out. I'm going to make it less discipline specific than it is, but it's about whether we have a preference for New York State artists and presenting them or publishing them or exhibiting them. We do not. There's nothing in our guidelines that says you must work with, you know, artists or, yeah, you're welcome to work with whoever artists. But that said, you have to be serving a community in New York State. This question does come up for organizations that have activities in more than one location. We are the New York State Council on the Arts, so we are partisan in that respect. So your application should focus on the activities that take place in and serve New York State artists, New York State audiences. If part of how you see that service is that you focus entirely on artists from New York State, that's fine and that's great, and you can discuss that as well. But there's no regulation that says you have to stick to that to people who reside here in terms of who you're working with your programming.
There are lots of questions, and again, I'm definitely seeing a lot of them are very specific to an organization. So I want to reiterate, if we do not get to your question in the next 5 minutes, because it's about to sign up, we will be looking at these questions, but I also encourage you to take those questions and send them directly to a program staff person to get a response. Someone asks, can I apply for a special opportunity grant as well as support for organizations? And the answer to that is yes. The special opportunity grants were a webinar yesterday, include things like folk arts apprenticeships and rehearsal space. So yes, the idea there, of course, is that you're either sponsoring an artist in folk arts or you're providing a service to other artists. It's not the same thing as additional grant to your organization.
There are a lot of people wanting to know what makes them ineligible to come in for support for organizations. And the big thing is really having multi-year support for fiscal year 22. So I'm going to say it again, just because it's one that's really coming up a lot. If you have a multi-year grant from NYSCA for fiscal year 21 and it concludes, then you are free to come in to support for organizations. If you have a multi-year grant for FY22 as well, and you want to keep that grant, then you are not coming in to support for organizations. And congratulations, you don't need to write a grant this year. However, if you really are itching to try out the new application, you are free to decline that award. If you want to decline that award, you would have to write to program staff before the application deadline. So by September 1st.
I think we have time. We have time for maybe one or two questions, and I really want to tackle this one. I realize data is incredibly important in quantifying our impact to our community. As a rural multi-arts community, our reach is considerably less than peers in more densely populated areas. How should we communicate our value with nuance to make a compelling case for impact? I think this is a really great question. Some of the most compelling cases that I have seen are ones that help me really understand your community. So forgive me here. So I have seen applications where an organization has explained their service area is bigger than the state of Delaware, that in the winter, some roads are impassable. So while their region has X population year round, half the year, it's nearly impossible for folks to get to their organization. I have seen a really small organization in a community say our annual population is 2,000 and we have 3,000 visitors every year. So they've exceeded their actual local population. So take your data, and if you're concerned, like I'm a rural organization, I have a small quantity of people coming, what's the context? Who's your potential audience? Maybe you're actually serving a huge percentage of them. Maybe you have hurdles that you can't get to you in a straight line because you're in the middle of the Catskills. That kind of nuance really helps us understand the situation you're in and provide that context that what might look compared to an urban area as a small population participating in your organization's activities, it might actually be a really large amount for the context in which you reside. I hope that helps. Christine.
Let's maybe do one more, and I see one that asks, what's the first step to apply for NYSCA funding? Again, apologies about noise outside my window here. But if you are totally new to NYSCA, you want to get pre-qualified as your first step. So find that section on our website. If you're not new, I would still say go to our website. The portal opens on July 19th, but all the questions and everything that you're going to need for your application are there. So if you're eager to get going, you can do that now because everything is going to be listed there. The last thing that you could do is sign up for office hours on Friday. Staff are going to be available to answer questions, really accessible. So as the capstone to webinar week, feel free to do that. And I'm going to turn things back over to Mara now.
Thank you guys for this incredibly rich conversation. Thanks to our audience for submitting such fantastic questions. Know that we're going to try to answer all your questions. So if we didn't get to today, you can find those answers either on our FAQ page on our website, or we may be emailing you directly. Please reach us directly, either during those office hours. Reach any member of staff. We're here to respond to you in every way we can, especially given the fact that we are embarking on such new opportunities this year. I want to remind you, okay, tomorrow is what? Tomorrow is the webinar for recovery, the recovery application, right? Separate from support for organizations. So remember, that's at 11 a.m. On Thursday, we're going to have the support for artists webinar. So please sign up for that if that's relevant to you, or share or please spread the word. We really appreciate that. I want to thank you all. I also wanted to make sure that we thank our Governor Cuomo, and the New York State Legislature. Without them, we would not be here and able to make, because they are allowing us to make a historic investment in the arts, $105 million for NYSCA this year. We are so very grateful. So in addition to today's webinars, as we all have shared, you can, we'll be hosting optional virtual office sessions on Friday the 16th, this Friday. You can sign up for those on our website. You can, reminder, please reach out to any NYSCA staff. And just so great to share the space with you today. And we are also excited to see your applications arrive at our doorstep. Thank you so much for joining us, and be well. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.